We've spoken about modernism. Now it's time to talk about anti-modernism, because there is never a thrust in American society, culture, economics, or politics that doesn't generate resistance and a counter thrust. That's what we see here. Let's talk first about some of the tenets or trends of anti-modernism, having done basically the same thing with modernism. Among anti-moderns, those people who resisted or reacted, was a quest for certainty in the face of uncertainty. We see that in the rise, which we'll talk about in a following lecture, of religious fundamentalism, particularly among Protestants, and of anti-intellectualism. We see a rise of urban values versus rural values versus urban values. That is some of the same literature that we saw in earlier America, particularly in the Gilded Age, that resisted the rise of cities and the kind of society that the big anonymous city brought forward. We see a revival of that among worried ruralites who see their way of life being threatened by the creation of towns and cities that seems to be unstoppable. We also see a fearful nationalism that's kind of rabid, beginning with the violent suppression of dissent, because violent suppression of dissent is part of a quest for certainty, and the violent suppression of difference. This, remember, was going on before, during, and even after the rise of modern tendencies to mainstream certain kinds of previous others. And then we see also in this fearful nationalism, combined with racism, xenophobia, that is a fear of foreigners. And this is not part of this anti-modernist thing isn't that we're seeing anything new. We're just seeing it more virulent and more widespread and much more vocal and organized than we've seen it before. We talked about nativism during the Gilded Age, and nativism stayed as a particularly virulent trend in American life. But even in the face of part of society accepting the presence of foreigners, or at least not resisting it, we see the success of xenophobic concepts, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, such as the National Origins Act, that successfully constricted immigration in the United States from the mid-1920s into the 1960s. One of the manifestations of this anti-modernist trend in American life was the revival of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, there's no direct relationship between the Ku Klux Klan of the immediate post-Civil War era under Nathan Bedford Forrest and under other similar leaders in various places, and the second Ku Klux Klan that was revived at Stone Mountain, Georgia, on Thanksgiving Day, 1915, by a guy named William J. Simmons, who had made his livelihood creating or rather recruiting for brotherhood societies, fraternal organizations, primarily insurance, health and burial insurance societies, things like the Knights of Pythias and smaller organizations that provided not only fellowship, this was endemic in this era, but also provided health insurance. In many cases, these organizations would buy a bed in a hospital, for example, and if you paid into the organization, you could use that bed if you needed hospitalization. but also burial insurance. And that was particularly what we would call life insurance today. That was a particularly lucrative area to both sell insurance and to create fraternal organizations around. It's something that we don't talk about very much right now because it's really for graduate study, but it is interesting to note that Americans at that time would join organizations and help bury each other rather than commercializing it in insurance industries. The Klan was sparked by a couple of different things, at least according to the New Georgia Encyclopedia Online. One was the playing in 1915 of Birth of a Nation, a movie by Griffith that extolled white racism over and subjugation of pretty dastardly stereotypes of African Americans. And the Leo Frank case and lynching in particular of a Jewish mill owner's son who was accused of raping and murdering a 15-year-old girl, Mary Phelan. Leo Frank was subsequently convicted of this crime and lynched by an Atlanta mob in 1915. Well, these two things sparked Simmons and his cohorts to go to Stone Mountain, Georgia, and pledge themselves as an organization calling themselves the Ku Klux Klan. And it was Simmons that devised that uniform that we always associate with the Klan of the white robe and the pointed hat. Over the course of the next 15 years, the Klan had a great hand in not only Southern politics, but in national politics, and in fact was stronger outside of the South than it was in the South. And there are a great many reasons for that. Its main thrust was to combat moral decline, to emphasize Calvinist morality, to restore ethnic purity of that most moral of races in the U.S., the Anglo-Saxon. And let me caution you right now that this is not my opinion. I am parroting the opinion of these people at this time. They fervently believed that Anglo-Saxons were the apogee of human beings, and that they were threatened by mongrelization and miscegenation, not only from African Americans, but from inferior races like, for example, the Irish or Eastern Europeans, that inbreeding would destroy this. They had this great Calvinist morality, and this is part of what you might consider to be rural values versus urban values, where urbanism encouraged somewhat lax morality. The Klan enforced a much more strident morality. In fact, outside of certain enclaves in the South, the people that suffered at the hands of Klan vigilantism the most were white women who were engaged in sexual activity of some form or another. The Klan was able to access real political power in the 1920s. And they were, in fact, the representatives of a rural backlash of economically marginalized white Americans against what they saw as a general corruption of American life. They were taken over. Simmons couldn't make the thing grow as fast as he wanted it to, and so he contacted some public relations people in Indiana, who then took over the Klan and made it something of a pyramid scheme and really spread it far and wide, changing its central message in the process from one of being anti-Black, which was common in the South, to being anti-Catholic for the most part. which played well in the North and the West. Eventually, there was a little too much violence for most people, and the corruption of the post-Simmons central leader of the Indiana Klan, a guy named David Stevenson, who you see pictured here, led to the demise of this second Klan. Now, some authors argue that the second Klan began to fall apart outside of the South, in large part because they had succeeded in gaining most of their program. Particularly after 1924, they had been able to secure a National Origins Act, that is, immigration restriction, which was the thing they were trying to sell the most. Now let's talk for just a second about David Stevenson and the shocking scandal that surrounded him. Stevenson kidnapped his secretary and raped her over the course of a few weeks, pretty constantly. But he was also, he eventually murdered her, not quickly, but by biting her so severely that she became infected. She was finally able to get away from him, and before she died of infection, remember this was the era before antibiotics were, particularly penicillin, was well known and well used. Penicillin wasn't introduced until 1941, but they could not stop this infection, and so she died after a couple of weeks of being incarcerated by him, molested by him, and then bitten savagely by him. And this was so shocking, not only to the general run of Americans, but also to the Klan itself, which would not countenance this kind of behavior, that it just kind of fell apart. The movement just kind of gave way. However, it was very strong, even a little bit after Simmons was convicted in 1927. And you see two images here, the Klan March in Washington, D.C. in 1925. In this case, it's the men, and then the women of the Klan marching in 1928. And the Klan sputtered on after Stevenson for a few years until it finally fell during the Depression in the 1930s. We normally associate the Klan with virulent racism, and that is in large part because of the so-called Third Klan, which arose in the 1950s, concomitant with and as a reaction to the civil rights movement. But not only was the Klan a harbinger of nativism as well as racism, but we see nativism as part and parcel of U.S. Domestic policy. Particularly, we see nativism as the underlying facet of the first Red Scare that occurred in 1919 and 1920. This Red Scare was a reaction to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, the communists taking over Russia in November of 1917. By 1919, A. Mitchell Palmer, the U.S. Attorney General you see pictured here, led raids. This is November 1919, and then again in January of 1920. Palmer and his ally, J. Edgar Hoover, who Palmer had appointed as the chief at 24 years old of the Bureau of Investigation, which throughout the 20th century would become known as the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, and J. Edgar Hoover would be its czar, an absolute autocrat. He got his start under Mitchell Palmer, and Palmer led the November 1919 raids on radical labor right organizations looking particularly for anarchists. And J. Edgar Hoover led the January 1920 raids looking for anarchists as well. They and the public who became hysterical about this, and there had been, it wasn't like there was nothing to become hysterical about. There had been a large number of bombings In fact, one of the reasons that Palmer began his raids was the January 1920 raid was because his house was bombed by a dynamiter. So public hysteria, as well as political policy, led to mass arrests, but only a few deportations. In large part because the Department of Labor, which was responsible for enforcing some of the arrests and the deportation hearings, believed that Mitchell Palmer had lost his mind and had gone far too far in unleashing xenophobia in the U.S. There were about 10,000 radicals, particularly anarchists, arrested, and a little over 500 were actually convicted and deported, which included, think back to our older lectures, the Pullman strike, the Homestead strike lecture of 1892. Not that the lecture was in 1892, but the strike was. And Alexander Berkman and his lady friend Emma Goldman, Red Emma, who was used as a boogeyman by parents who wanted to get their children to behave. They were arrested and deported. Alexander Berkman, you might remember, attempted to assassinate Henry Frick, who was the manager of the Homestead plant. Okay, another manifestation of nativism besides the Red Scare was the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. These were two Italian anarchists who were arrested in 1920 for committing a bank robbery. They were accused of committing the bank robbery. They were arrested and tried on somewhat circumstantial evidence. They were tried. They were convicted principally on public hysteria. Their case lingered as they attempted to get stays of execution. One of the armed guards had been killed in this, and so the charge was murder. This occurred in Massachusetts. The Judge Thayer, made it known that he was already prejudiced against Sacco and Vanzetti. He said at one point that he would get those anarchists good and proper. This was prior to trial. And in an odd quirk of Massachusetts law, in order to get a rehearing and an appeal, the original trial judge had to agree that he made some errors, and Thayer never thought he made any errors. It took until 1927, the trial was fast, but it took until 1927 for the wheels of justice, so to speak, to grind, and Sacco and Vanzetti were executed in 1927. Now, this had become a cause célèbre for workers and leftists worldwide. People around the globe protested and wanted the release of Sacco and Vanzetti. Later scholars believe that Vanzetti was innocent of this, but Sacco may have had a hand in this. He may actually have been one of the robbers. And in the photograph that you see here of the two fellows at the bottom, Vanzetti is the fellow to the left with the large walrus mustache. He was a fishmonger. That is, he sold fish from a cart in Boston. And Sacco, who was a shoemaker in a factory, you see to the right here. Now, nativism came to a head politically with immigration restriction acts that followed World War I. In 1921, Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act, which restricted immigration to a quota of 3% of that nationality as found in the 1910 census. That means that if there were 100 Czechs discovered in the 1910 census, then every year free checks would be given visas to come into the United States. Well, by 1924, Nativist agitation tightened those restrictions, and in the National Origins Act, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, those quotas were changed from 3% in the 1910 census to 2% in the 1890 census. Now, this was a pretty significant change, not because of the percentage, but because the census date changed. By 1910, we were 5 years into a significant increase in the number of Eastern Europeans and Middle Easterners that were immigrating to the U.S. But in 1890, the U.S. was still peopled primarily by Western Europeans. Western Europeans. So this system present in the National Origins Act of 1924 or the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 favored Northwest Europeans over Southern and Eastern Europeans. Now, the Johnson-Reed Act reestablished that the Chinese and Japanese were completely excluded. Well, this ends our lecture on anti-modernism. Our next lecture will be on religious fundamentalism, but we saw that anti-modernism arose at the same time as modernism. It was a quest for certainty. It extolled rural values over urban values, and it had as one of its tenets a fearful nationalism and fearful racism. At the same time, it's not intellectually or morally bankrupt, but we did look at some of the more disturbing manifestations of anti-modernism. Thank you very much.